Imagine waking up one morning to discover that a foreign military power has been secretly mapping every inch of your country's coastline. Not for weeks, not for months, but for years. And you had no idea. This isn't a dystopian movie plot. This actually happened to Australia. And when they finally caught on, what they discovered was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive into one of the most shocking chapters of Cold War history that almost no one talks about, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and whether your country has any secret military stories that deserve to be told. Trust me, after you hear this story, you'll be looking at your own coastline very differently. The year is 1970-something. The Cold War is at its frozen peak. The world is divided into two camps and everyone knows the players, the United States and the Soviet Union. But there's a third player in this game that nobody's paying much attention to. A country so far removed from the main theaters of conflict that both superpowers consider it insignificant, a strategic afterthought. That country is Australia. And the Soviets are about to learn the hard way that underestimating the quiet ones is always a fatal mistake. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about submarines and naval operations. This is a story about how a nation that the world wrote off as a distant, laid-back outpost in the Pacific orchestrated one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations of the Cold War era. This is about arrogance meeting competence, about the hunted becoming the hunter, and about how sometimes the most dangerous people in the room are the ones nobody's watching. Let's set the scene. Bass Strait, a body of water separating Tasmania from mainland Australia. To most people, it's just a shipping lane, a patch of ocean notorious for rough seas and fishing trawlers. Nothing special, nothing strategic, or so everyone thought. But to the Royal Australian Navy, Bass Strait was about to become ground zero for something extraordinary. The protagonist of our story isn't a single person, it's an entire institution that the world had written off as a junior partner, a minor league player in the great game of global military strategy. The Royal Australian Navy in the 1970s wasn't exactly what you'd call intimidating. No massive carrier groups, no nuclear submarines, no flashy demonstrations of power, just a modest fleet, competent personnel, and a coastline that stretched for over 25,000 kilometers. 25,000 kilometers of vulnerability that, if you were a strategic planner in Moscow, looked like an intelligence goldmine just waiting to be exploited. Here's what made the Australian Navy special, though nobody knew it yet. For decades, they'd been quietly, methodically building expertise in underwater warfare and submarine detection. While bigger navies got the headlines and the glory, Australian sonar operators were becoming some of the best-trained specialists in the world. They had to be. Because Australia's strategic position meant that if a conflict ever broke out in the Pacific, their waters would become a crucial battleground. So they trained, they listened, they waited, and they learned patience. Patience that was about to pay off in ways nobody expected. Now let's talk about the other side of this equation, the Soviet Union, specifically the Soviet Pacific Fleet submarine force. These weren't just submarines. They were technological marvels, operated by crews who considered themselves the elite of the elite. And they had good reason for that confidence. Soviet submarines in the 1970s were among the most advanced in the world. Silent, deadly, equipped with sophisticated mapping and intelligence-gathering equipment. And they operated under one crucial assumption. Nobody would detect them, especially not the Australians. The Soviet Naval Command had a particular kind of arrogance. They'd spent decades playing cat and mouse with the American Navy, testing their detection systems, probing their defenses. They'd mapped coastlines from Norway to Japan. They'd lurked in waters where they absolutely should not have been, gathering intelligence, preparing for a conflict they hoped would never come but were determined to win if it did. And Australia. Australia was supposed to be easy. A backwater. A nation too trusting, too isolated, too unsophisticated to even know. They were being watched. The Soviet planners had their reasons for this confidence. Australia's anti-submarine warfare capabilities were, on paper, modest. Their fleet was small. Their technology, from the Soviet perspective, was nothing special. And Australia itself seemed more concerned with its alliance with the United States than with developing its own independent military capabilities. It was the perfect target for a long-term intelligence operation. Map the coastline. Identify the deep water approaches. Catalog every harbor, every inlet, every strategic position. Build a database so comprehensive that if war ever came, Soviet submarines would know Australian waters better than the Australians themselves. So they came, one submarine at a time. Quiet, confident, certain they were invisible. The detection happened almost by accident. It was supposed to be a routine training exercise. Australian naval vessels in Bass Strait, running their sonar arrays, practicing the art of submarine detection in one of the most challenging acoustic environments in the world. Bass Strait isn't an easy place to operate. The water's relatively shallow, the currents are complex, and there's enough maritime traffic to create a constant background noise. It's the kind of place where finding a submarine is like finding a whisper in a thunderstorm. But then, there it was. A contact. Subtle, brief, but unmistakable to the trained sonar operators who'd spent years learning to distinguish between a fishing trawler, a whale, and something else. Something that moved with purpose. Something that was trying very, very hard not to be detected. The operators looked at each other, checked their instruments, ran the signature through their databases, and realized what they were looking at. A Soviet submarine, in Australian waters, not passing through, lingering, operating in a pattern that suggested it wasn't just transiting, it was working, mapping, gathering intelligence. The tension in that control room must have been electric, because this wasn't just a stray submarine that had wandered off course. This was a deliberate incursion, a violation of Australian sovereignty. And if there was one, the question everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to say out loud was, how many more are there? The Australian Navy did something remarkable at that moment. They didn't panic. They didn't immediately broadcast their discovery. They didn't rush to confront the submarine or force it to surface. Instead, they did what they'd been training to do for years. They watched, they listened, they tracked, and they kept their mouths shut. What happened next was like peeling back layers of an onion, except each layer revealed something more disturbing than the last. Because once the Australian Navy knew what to look for, once they'd identified the acoustic signature and operating patterns of that first Soviet submarine, they started finding more, and more, and more. It wasn't just Bass Strait. The Soviet submarines were everywhere, off the coast of Western Australia, near the approaches to Sydney Harbour, in the waters around Perth, lurking near the naval base at Stirling, operating in the Coral Sea. Each submarine following a methodical pattern, mapping the ocean floor, charting underwater geography, identifying strategic choke points, measuring water temperature and salinity, cataloging everything that would give them an advantage if they ever needed to operate in these waters. During a conflict, the Australian analysts started putting together a picture that was frankly terrifying. This wasn't a recent operation. Based on the patterns, based on the sophistication of what the Soviets were doing, this had been going on for years, possibly since the late 1960s. The Soviet Union had been systematically, comprehensively mapping the entire Australian coastline, and nobody had noticed. Here's where the story gets even more incredible. The Australian Navy faced a choice. They could go public, create an international incident, force a diplomatic confrontation, or they could do something far more strategically valuable. They could keep watching, keep learning, turn the tables on an adversary who thought they were operating with impunity. They chose option 2, and in doing so, they transformed from the hunted into the hunter. What the Soviet Navy didn't know was that every time they sent a submarine into Australian waters, they were being tracked, catalogued, studied. The Australians were building their own database, learning Soviet operating procedures, identifying individual submarines by their acoustic signatures, mapping out the entire scope of the intelligence operation being conducted against them. This is where the Australian Navy showed its true sophistication. They didn't just track the submarines, they used the Soviet presence to dramatically upgrade their own capabilities. Every contact was a training opportunity. Every detection was a chance to refine their techniques. They installed new sonar arrays in strategic locations. They developed new tracking algorithms. They coordinated with American and British intelligence, sharing information, building a comprehensive picture of Soviet submarine operations across the entire Pacific. And they did it all in silence, because the greatest advantage you can have over an adversary is for them to think they're winning when they're actually giving you everything you need to defeat them. The Soviet submarine commanders thought they were conducting a masterful intelligence operation. In reality, they were teaching the Australian Navy how to hunt them. Now, here's where we get to the shocking truth that eventually came to light. When Australian naval intelligence finally compiled all their findings, the numbers were staggering. Over 40 different Soviet submarines had been operating in or near Australian waters over the course of several years. 40 submarines conducting a Comprehensive mapping and intelligence gathering operation on a scale that defied comprehension. Think about that for a moment. 40 submarines. That's not a minor reconnaissance effort. That's a full-scale intelligence operation involving a significant portion of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's submarine force. It represented thousands of hours of operating time, millions of rubles in resources, enormous risk, and an assumption of total impunity. And the Australians had detected every single one of them. The revelation, when it finally became known within intelligence circles, sent shockwaves through the global naval community. Because it meant several things, all of them significant. First, it meant that Soviet intelligence had severely underestimated Australian capabilities. They'd walked into a trap of their own making, believing their own propaganda about Australian military insignificance. Second, it meant that the Royal Australian Navy had capabilities far beyond what anyone, including their own allies, had given them credit for. And third, it meant that there was a massive intelligence operation being conducted in the Pacific that had implications far beyond Australia. The Soviet reaction, when they eventually realized they'd been detected, must have been something to behold. Years of careful work, millions in resources, sophisticated operations, all compromised, all because they'd underestimated a navy they considered beneath their notice. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The Australian response to this revelation wasn't chest-thumping or aggressive confrontation. It was strategic brilliance wrapped in characteristic Australian understatement. They used the intelligence they'd gathered to fundamentally transform their maritime defense capabilities. The detection network they'd built to track Soviet submarines became the foundation for one of the most sophisticated underwater surveillance systems in the world. They invested in new submarines of their own. They expanded their sonar arrays. They developed partnerships with other Pacific nations to create a comprehensive maritime awareness network. They turned their vulnerability into strength, their perceived weakness into a genuine capability that changed the strategic calculus of the entire region. And they did it quietly. No grandstanding, no public humiliation of the Soviet Union. Just quiet, competent professionalism that spoke volumes about the character of the institution and the nation it represented. The Soviet submarines gradually stopped coming. Not because they were forced out, but because the mission had become pointless. The Australians knew they were there. The advantage was gone. And more importantly, continuing the operation would only teach the Australians more about Soviet capabilities while yielding diminishing intelligence returns. So what's the lesson here? What's the universal message that resonates far beyond naval operations and cold war strategy? First, never underestimate the quiet ones. The people, the institutions, the nations that don't make a lot of noise, that don't constantly demand attention, that focus on competence rather than appearance, they're often far more capable than anyone realizes. The Soviets learned this the hard way when they discovered that the insignificant Australian Navy had been running circles around them the entire time. Second, arrogance is a blindness that defeats itself. The Soviet submarine force was among the best in the world. Their technology was excellent. Their training was rigorous. But their assumption of superiority, their conviction that nobody could touch them, created a vulnerability that negated all their advantages. They stopped being careful because they didn't think they needed to be. And that carelessness cost them everything. Third, patience and strategic thinking beat brute force and intimidation every single time. The Australian Navy could have confronted those submarines, created incidents, forced diplomatic crises. Instead, they waited, they watched, they learned. And in doing so, they gained far more than they ever could have through confrontation. They turned an adversary's operation against them, using it as a training ground to build capabilities that would serve them for decades. Fourth, transformation often comes from adversity. Australia could have been intimidated by the discovery that a superpower had been mapping their coastline for years. Instead, they used it as motivation to build something remarkable. They took the threat seriously, invested in their capabilities, and emerged stronger, more sophisticated, and more strategically valuable than ever before. And finally, respect is earned through competence, not volume. The Australian Navy didn't demand respect. They didn't need to. Their actions spoke louder than any propaganda. When the intelligence community eventually learned what they'd accomplished, the respect came naturally, earned through quiet excellence. This incredible chapter of history that most people have never heard, reminds us that the world is full of unsung heroes, institutions and individuals who do extraordinary things without fanfare, who protect and serve without seeking recognition, who build and create while others are busy talking about building and creating. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about military strategy, about Australia, about the Cold War, or about the power of quiet competence, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates real history and incredible stories of strategic brilliance. Drop a comment telling me what you think about this operation and whether you knew anything about it before today. And subscribe. Because there are so many more stories like this out there. Stories of incredible competence, strategic brilliance, and unexpected heroes that deserve to be told. Stories that remind us that the world is far more complex, far more interesting, and far more full of remarkable people than the headlines would have us believe. The next time you look at a map, remember that under the surface, there are layers of history, strategy, and human drama that would blow your mind if you knew them. The Australian Navy knew that. And they used that knowledge to win a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical of simple narratives, and never underestimate the quiet ones.